Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with my great friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi everyone, this is Chen, your friend. I'm a cultural historian of medieval Europe and China. Great to be here.
Today, we're going to continue our conversation on um, niche construction, the book by John Odling Smee that we have been working on for the past few episodes. Just a very brief summary of what has happened so far and why we are here at this moment. And then we can kind of dive right in to the next layer of Alding Smee's argument. What is important about niche construction is its relationship to the standard evolution theory. What Alding Smee is trying to convince the readers of is that although the modern synthesis, the idea that the evolution is about natural selection and specifically genetic natural selection, and that's the end of the story, is radically lacking. Not because evolutionary theory, standard evolutionary theory, is just indifferent to ecology, because someone believing in the standard evolutionary theory could simply say that ecology is great, but that standard evolutionary theory does not recognize specific aspects of ecology as relevant to evolutionary theory. So what Odling Smee is trying to do is to show not just ecology as like a broad concept, but specifically niche construction as an activity that exists in not just animal kingdom, but even like bacteria, is something that is essential for evolution, and it is under recognized by standard evolutionary theory. And the reason that niche construction is for Odling Smee something of that priority gets to his understanding, or it gets its roots from his understanding of life. Odling Smee is ultimately telling us that what evolution or evolutionary theory needs to be about is evolution of life. It's not about anything else. And if it's about evolution of life, we need to understand what life is. And as Odling Smee recognizes, life has requirements. And one requirement is what he calls bioinformatics of life, and the other requirement is bioenergetics of life. And of course, there is a layer of reproduction or inheritance in the form of reproduction that is required for the evolution aspect of it. Now, a lot of the things that Odling Smee is interested in is basically the question of how information is inherited um, down the line in evolutionary process, and how that passing on of information is intertwined with the need or constraint of energy for living beings. And ultimately, what Odling Smee wants to say is niche construction, the agent-like activity of organisms to reshape their environment, is a form of, number one, changing, modifying, transforming, destroying selective pressures that those organisms or their descendants might face. And two, niche construction is responsible for non-genetic forms of transferring of information. And because life is about that transfer of information and the relationship that that information has with energy, we cannot deny the role of niche construction in evolution. Trent?
Yes, has to elucidate a really key message you just delivered is for Odlin's me. that the traditional standard evolutionary theory is kind of taking apart as a whole in the story of the evolution of life instead of looking at all the parameters needs to be balanced, including both information and energy. As ET, according to him, looks only at how the transmission of know-how through genes evolves and its pattern of change. That for Smee is incomplete. You must understand the role the genetically based transmission plays in the sustenance as well as the modification of life as a whole. So with that said, I think we can jump into today's topic.
Yes. So like as we are now understand, like the point that Odling Smee is trying to make is in a lot of ways is about different inheritance systems, information inheritance systems, and like understanding that he definitely recognizes the role of genetics or genetic population genetics. Pardon me. Now it's time to talk about other information inheritance systems that Odling Smee think are relevant to the evolutionary process, and they are best understood under the umbrella term of niche construction. In other words, the parallel information inheritance systems that exist in nature and are evolutionarily relevant to the process of life, speciation, survival of species, so on and so forth. Those information inheritance systems are ultimately intertwined with niche construction. We want to see what these parallel information inheritance systems are and how they are related to niche construction today. The names that Odling and Smee are going to give these are going to be relevant to like historical associations, like in the sense that the parallels that Odling and Smee finds in information systems and information inheritance systems get intertwined with like old conversations in the history of biology or history of the relation between biology and culture. And one of those historical moments is Lamarck. And it's the famous kind of clash or debate that existed between Lamarck and Darwin, and like later on continued with different people involved in that debate. And to understand one of these information inheritance systems that Odling Smee wants to talk about, and in some ways, both of the parallel information inheritance systems that Odling Smee wants to talk about, we need to kind of like review a little bit about what is this debate about, because the book itself also puts some emphasis on it and how it gets related to what Odling Smee is trying to prove and how it is different. Okay, so the idea is very simple, and probably a lot of you have heard of this. And this idea is about natural selection and what exactly happens when we say natural selection is really this kind of invisible hand in nature. Right? And the phenomenon that was in front of both Lamarck and Darwin was very similar in the sense that they didn't have access to genetics, they didn't have, microscopic knowledge of life. What they had was basically organisms, and like observable organisms. And of course, like the differences and variations within those populations. Famous example was the example of the giraffes, right? We see that giraffes have long necks, and we want to see why they have long necks. And both Darwin and Lamarck are interested in that question. And Lamarck has a story about this length of neck in giraffes. And the story is that we have giraffes, they have like whatever, like medium size like necks, but for whatever reason the lower half of like trees or whatever giraffes eat is not accessible anymore. Other animals are taking it or whatever, and the giraffes need to really kind of drag themselves up to be able to reach those like leaves on the upper side of the tree. And as they do that, like generation by generation, they do that, their necks start to grow. So, putting it differently, individual stretching of a giraffe's neck is something that is going to be inherited by their descendants. And this process goes on until like we reach a point that you don't need to stretch anymore, and that's why nothing else happens, right? And we get kind of like a norm of like length that is pretty predictable. That's the story that Lomark wants to say, and like in the language that is going to be useful to what we are going to talk about, that just means individual change in an individual or a group of individuals within a population during their lifetime directly impacts what is passed on to the next generation. That's basically the idea that Lamarck has. Darwin has a completely different idea about the same story. It's not that any giraffe is like stretching their neck, or there are giraffes that are stretching their necks, but that's not what is passed on. That's not how it works. It just happens to be the case that giraffes come with different neck sizes. That's just a variation that exists within that population. Now, if for whatever reason there are only leaves available to giraffes that are on top of the tree, the giraffes that don't have long necks, they just cannot reach it. So they face starvation, they face disadvantage in like mating, so on and so forth. Basically, they don't survive. They don't get to reproduce and survive. And the subgroup of giraffes that actually makes it happens to be the giraffes that had long necks. This wasn't about anyone stretching their necks. This was just about the fittest giraffes winning the race, right? The race of reproduction. And that's why we see giraffes with long necks. And this story is true like across the living sphere, and also not just about like it gets translated into the language of genetics as well, right? Like genes being changed during their lifetime, whatever that means, doesn't change them in the same way that we like. It's not in a Lamarckian way, right? It's not like that they change and then they reproduce somehow, and then we just get a new thing. Last kind of summary of this: no change in the individual life and organism is enough for changing that individual or that population at a genetic level. And therefore, those types of individual changes are not the types of things that get passed on, right? Just like if you go to the gym and you become a bodybuilder, your children are not going to be more muscular, right? You made that change, but that doesn't really get transferred. And this idea, Darwin winning this debate, definitely kind of found its way in the modern synthesis and the new Darwinian image of natural selection. Every change is about this kind of population genetics, and population genetics has nothing to do with individual learning during one organism's lifetime. That's irrelevant. Trent?
Yeah, you did a great job. I have nothing to add. This debate pretty much summarizes the SET standard evolutionary theories, like modern synthesis position about how isolated or how removed the individual life history is to like the history of a species evolution itself.
Exactly. And this is relevant, this debate is relevant both for elucidating what John Odling Smee talks about and understanding like how he's locating himself within this debate on the nature of evolution. Because as introduced earlier in the earlier episodes, Odling Smee thinks that there are three layers of bioinformatics in life. One is population genetics, the second is individual learning, and the third one is cultural transmission. In other words, Odling Smee wants to give us an argument in which individual learning of organisms matters insofar as evolution is concerned. And this should sound very alarming at first, because you might ask yourself, is this a return to the failed project of Lamarck? And it's not. The difference, as we're going to explain more in a second, is that individual learning, in Odling Smee's viewpoint, does not necessarily or in an immediate way change the genetics of that individual, right? It's not that like you learn something and suddenly your genetics are different. Still, individual learning can change the selective pressures for the genes as they go on their path to the descendants of that individual. And that's what we want to unpack and see what exactly it means. Now, what is individual learning? I think that's the kind of the basis of understanding like what is going on. Because we can think about individual learning as something that is just like, I learn a language, right? Like that's that kind of learning. It could be like learning in terms of, finding a new way to get to food, right? Like learning could be a lot of things. But there are a couple of things that Odling Smee mentions, and I think it is interesting to see how they kind of show up, because there are examples in Odling Smee about individual learning that get very close to the way that like Theseus, the robotic mouse functioned and quote unquote learned. Meaning that the learning that Odling Smee has in mind does not need to be anything verbal, linguistic, human, requiring brain, or anything like that. Insofar as it has that kind of a structure of detect, register, and express, we're good. And one very important example of this layer of individual or individualized learning that Odling Smee talks about is development of antibodies. That our immune systems are not developed based on like a predetermined list of pathogens and how to deal with them, right? The body does not come with a full list of here are the pathogens in the environment, here's how to deal with them. In fact, it is about a different form of kind of like learning process for the immune system to figure out how to deal with them, and then remembering those and like kind of like getting to a point of expressing that learned, quote unquote, learned behavior at the right time, right? And this itself has an evolutionary advantage because viruses, for instance, are very good at, creating new combinations. There are viruses that exist, like the cold, related, flu related viruses, and bacteria that exist like this winter are going to be different from the last one. So if you just have one list of like, whatever bacteria that you need to deal with, then you're dead, right? So I'm mentioning this point about this kind of advantage of like incompleteness because I think this gets related to like one of the major things we want to kind of take away from this, that there is a parallel between this and what we discussed last time about the adaptive advantage of agency, right? And here it's not about adaptive advantage of agency at the level of organism or like brains or anything like that. There is something about this incompleteness, this kind of process of trial and error that really kind of matters in this stage of dealing with pathogens, because it is evolutionarily advantageous to have a system that is not fully complete, right? And these antibodies, there are a couple of things that happens. First of all, like Odling and Smee mentions ways that new studies find some of these antibodies getting transferred through uterus, and as the mother is giving birth, or like the kind of a mother baby relationship. That's one thing that I do not have the scientific knowledge to really say whether those studies like are sound or not. But it is also important in the sense that definitely this is something that is important for the survival of that individual or survival of a specific population. Like the fact that whether this organism is going to survive or not is not just about all like the genetic information that it has and it just kind of unfolding of those. It is about these things that is actually learning as it is going about things that are not predetermined inferences. They have to be designed by evolution in the way that they are expecting novelties. They're expecting something that hasn't been seen. And in this sense, this is going to be relevant, that it is important in the process of like moving on as an organism, and the ability or inability to pass on genes or not be able to pass on genes. So when we are thinking about these kind of processes, we need to think about them in the way that, number one, some of these very kind of like purely kind of biological developments that happens in the individual's time, number one, might get transferred in some ways. And number two, definitely what happens during those individual processes will determine whether the configuration of genes that get passed on is going to actually get passed on or not. If someone lacks this ability, or one's immune system is incapable of creating the antibody that is needed for a specific pathogen without having any like genetic defects necessarily, that genetic configuration may not make it to the next round, right? Not because the genetics were not competitive, but because something else wasn't competitive. I think that's something that is important. Something that is a little bit more, I think, like intuitively present, just more like at the level of organisms, is that niche construction, remember, is very kind of a wide category, right? It's not about just like beavers building dams. It's about like relocating or like, using a tool in a certain way. So if I have a genetic configuration and I have selective pressures in front of like those genetic um, configuration that I just happen to have, and for whatever reason, let's say my body is not very good at like temperature adjustment, right? And my environment happens to be fluctuating in temperature in extreme ways. So now I am at the danger of like not making it. But if I relocate, I change the selective pressures and I can survive. Which means if I learn where is the environment that my genes are going to pass on, I have changed the answer to the question of whether this configuration of genes survive or don't. But not because not just because of the genes themselves, but because what I made out of what I had at that given time. Again, here is a question. Do I make the relocation because of some genetic demand, right? Like there is something genetically in me that is responsible for like finding a new location. How strict is that genetic component in the sense like I have a gene that says if your temperature is not like comfortable and make you ready for like reproduction, move? What kind of gene component is that? Crudely said, what is the gene component of agency, if there is anything of that kind? If there is, like, if that's the story here. And also, there is this whole point about individual learning in different ways, right? Like, if I am, let's say the temperature thing again, right? If I am part of this kind of subpopulation of humanity that we all like our bodies is not good at temperature like adjustment, right? But maybe we can build very, very comfy houses and we can weave like clothing that is really like it makes it easy to kind of switch up as much as we want based on what the temperature is, right? Now, that is also changing something about the selective pressures in front of me, right? The selective pressures in front of me is going to just change in front of my genes, is going to change based on what I can do, right? If I mimic a strong member of my troop and so we see that now I can use this specific kind of a tool. Now I am changing what matters as a selective pressure. And this is, of course, not just about like learning how to like make a tool or relocating. It is also about learning a lesson and remember it at the right time, right? If I have a weak body and there is a genetic component of that, but I like my parents teach me to use a specific defensive tool or defensive move that is very useful when I'm attacked, right? Or if I get really good at making knives and then when the danger happens, I know how to like retrieve my knife and use it, then I can change the kind of selective pressure that is in front of me. What matters in my genes, which of my genes is going to survive, is dependent on that agent like action that I will go through and I will execute in my lifetime. And that is the sense that Odling Smee is saying that there is there is a way for individual learning for like impacting the evolutionary process, because this is all about information, right? Like it's about information and registering that information and expressing that information at the right time, right? Just like the antibodies, right? They get informed, they reduce the uncertainty of what to do with a pathogen. And after that, they build immunity against that because, quote unquote, they remember, right? And in the same way, when I learn how to build a knife and use it, I am reducing some uncertainty, right? That uncertainty is about how to defend myself, but it's not just only about that, but it's about actually how I can make a thing, right? How I can make like a tool here and how I can use it. When I reduce the uncertainty and I register that in my memory, which is in this case could be like individual nervous system, and retrieve it at the right moment, in that sense, we are dealing with a specific kind of information system that is not genetics, but very much relevant in terms of like what genes survive, or in the sense of how life would evolve, right? Like if you have a group of human beings that have really weak bodies, but they're great fighters with knives, then you will get a different story of how life evolves, right? And last thing, and in some ways most interestingly, the selective pressure now changes. The selective pressure is now not on the like how big your muscles are. It's about how good you are, the genes that will help you get better at making knives, right? That was just started because some other groups started doing that, right? If the neighboring group doesn't develop that habit, then there's no need for me to really get good at that. They are creating pressures. The knife builders and knife fighters are creating selective pressure, not only for themselves, but for others as well. And this story continues. Trent.
Yes, kind of to summarize the few really important points you gave in that, like a very elaborate explanation. One is that there's always like life is always balancing between the need for specificity and like more like a general purpose kind of a capacity, because like the more specific you are, a lot of all challenges or the selective pressures that the individual organism experience are extremely specific. For instance, a specific strain of the virus, and that it's impossible for the genetic system to encode every single one. Not only because there are too many of them, but also because, as you mentioned, like those other life forms like a virus, they mutate very fast that we cannot catch up through like genetic evolution in that sense. So individual learning is a really important way to figure out how we made it as a species. We must concede there's a space left for that, not specified, not predetermined the capacity, as you mentioned, the experience, the example of antibodies. And this, I think, manifests in two different levels. One is like life history of an organism. Once I'm exposed to a certain virus, that I'll, if I survive, I will be kind of immune or ready to fight back once a similar virus shows up again. Second is like this might, not an expert on this, but they might find a way to transmit it to the next generation through certain other ways, not genetically modified ways. And this also applies to other type of like adaptive know-how you mentioned. Like basically, when we're thinking about natural selection, we need to consider not just the genetic part of the story, but also it's really the expression of genetic resources that are in relationship with the environment, namely through the process of selective pressures. And those are things we identified here, like individual learning, especially change that the selective pressure, therefore impact the way how species or life evolves without necessarily exclusively through the mediation of genes. Yes.
Yeah, and I think there's something to basically add to that, and I think using that as a segue for the next like layer of this, which is very much interconnected. I think that the thing is like that, and this data gets shared by Odling and Smee a couple of times, and that's just like number of genes, right? Like human beings, I think, have 22,000 genes,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, and like that's as almost as many genes as a salamander has.
Mm-hmm.
Like a specific salamander with no brain and like complicated nervous system. So I think it's very interesting, like when we're thinking about genes, what do we expect from genes, right? And I'm no expert on genes, right? But I think if given the complexity of things that human beings can do, for instance, and salamanders cannot, if genes were only there to just give us like commands of like dealing with specific scenarios, then this doesn't really make any sense. Because we definitely are dealing with far more complicated circumstances and variations or variables in our decision making that genes are not cannot possibly have answer to every scenario in a very automated way. So whatever they are doing, I think Odling and Smee wants to have a specific interpretation of this, but like this is something that I think it's very interesting to think about. Whatever they are doing, they're not just giving us an inference, predetermined inference list. And if they are not doing that, the other thing that they can give us is something that we can call agency, a minimal form of agency, right? So it's not that agency is like somewhere and genetics is somewhere else. Agency is a result of genetics, a specific type of genetics, because of its competitive advantage. And all these points about individual learning, whether it's happening within an organism through antibodies, or it is happening in terms of me learning how to fight with knives, or use a tool, or like move to a different country, learning all of these things is something that is not something that is going outside of the genes in any sort of a radical way. It is something that the genes allow to happen. But because it is not just about genes commanding me to do something, I think Odling and Smee thinks of this as a form of agency, which in this case shows itself in this kind of an individualized form of niche construction or individual form of adaptation that will impact the selective pressures and therefore impact how life evolves, right? And just one quick thing, because before moving to the last point, remember that Odling and Smee is kind of going to a kind of a meta level and saying that, look, evolutionary biology, if it's about evolutionary biology as the name suggests, needs to be about what it takes for life to evolve. And if it's there to give a comprehensive answer to that question, it cannot only talk about genes. Because when you talk about genes, you are basically kind of treating them as if they are merely these, command machines, right? Not that they kind of open a door, open a game, that now that game is being played, and now some other genes survive. And I think that's kind of the basic thing that Odling and Smee is trying to suggest. Now, of course, this whole thing about individual learning, even in the examples that we gave, gets related to a different form of transmission. And Odling and Smee calls this the cultural transmission. The interesting thing about cultural transmission is, I mean, of course, cultural transmission is about non-genetic transmission of information. Okay, that's the first thing. And the second thing is that the way Odling and Smee talks about cultural transmission, it is very much of a, same spectrum, if not the same exact thing in different organisms, right? And the basic idea of this is that, okay, I transfer information genetically. I transfer information to myself through my individual learning. One day I learn how to build a knife and use a knife. The other day I actually use it, right? That's transfer of information. There is transmission there. But then if I teach my children to do something, to use knives or to have manners or to build a house, how to build a house, like all those things, those become cultural transmissions, right? And in non-human animals, this takes the shape of like mimicking, right? They're just like mimicking others and they kind of building like mini traditions, for the lack of a better term. And for human beings, because we have language, this kind of take a different shape. We don't need to really just mimic, right? We can just record in different ways. And that recording could be like saved and retrieved in different ways. That's basically the difference. So the point here, I think, is to think about culture as niche construction. That culture is about traditions of changing the environment and oneself in certain ways, right? This could be a repeat, right? This could be tradition in the more kind of essence of the term type of a way, that when you have a tradition, there is some form of repetition, expectation of repetition. But this could be also repetition in a way that it generates new things, right? It could be like a repetitive act to, honor the culture of startups, right? That requires a lot of traditions, that requires a lot of practices, that requires a lot of changing the environment, right? Like it's a system building of human beings is a form of niche construction, right? But that doesn't mean the content is going to be the exact same thing, right? The content is going to change. Right? There's a dynamism there. And it is kind of interesting to note that Odling and Smee doesn't talk about this much, about like how the human type of cultural niche construction might be different from other animals. He just briefly mentions language and spends the last kind of chapter of the book talking about sort of like all negative ways that the human niche construction has changed the selective pressures on other animals and like the ecological balance and things of that nature, right? He doesn't tell us much about like what exactly means to have a human specific cultural niche construction and the transmission. What matters is that this is about a non-genetic inheritance system of information that is also not just about individual learning. It's kind of a population. So we had population genetics that was this kind of an unconscious whole that was happening. Then we have individual learning that could be like this kind of a spark that changes something about the environment, and this sparks going to some sort of a fire that now is like encompassing all the population, and that is culture. So there's kind of a back and forth between the two, and that level of cultural population changes the selective pressures, changes the genes that get selected. The genes create individuals. Those individuals either just use those culturally transmitted information, or as individuals learn something new, and that learned new thing begins a cultural transmission, and so on and so forth. So these are like levels that are just kind of like intertwined. And it doesn't matter like whether it is about teaching baby beavers to build dams, or like maintaining legal continuity of a nation state. The point is that this is all about information transmission, and ultimately at the biological level, it's about manipulating the energy information ratio, right? The types of inheritance work, whether it's genetics, individual learning, or cultural, that manipulate the energy information ratio on the right direction, which is the energy spent for gaining information is compensated by the information that is received, meaning that that information reduces the energy needed for the next round, right? Like, I mean, you can see this in cultural traditions as well, right? I mean, the cultural traditions in terms of, legal stability, or house building, or, how to cook food. Like, all of these are just about these types of information that energy was spent on them. And it was a lot of energy to get the information for the first round. But insofar as we've been able to kind of maintain those and transmit those, we can learn how to cook food, prepare food, eat food with much less like expenditure of energy, just because we have the right type of information, right? And once that manipulation happens, the selection pressures on organisms are different. And if they are different, the direction of evolution of life is different, right? So this is not, and none of this is about a return to landmark, right? None of this is about like I stretch my neck and like my kid is gonna have a longer neck, right? But it is about the change that might happen at my individual life that in a different way really determines how my kid looks like, right? Like, if individually and then probably culturally we get really good at protecting ourselves without having really like big muscles, probably in like 100 generations the muscles start to not be as relevant, right? They become, a more like relaxed variable than anything that, oh, if you don't have the muscle, you're going to die, right? Which probably was the case like 100,000 years ago, right? So if it's about generation to generation impact, if we understand the evolution of life correctly, which is about the information energy ratio, not only the genetics, not just the genetic layer, the population genetics layer, but also these other layers, individual learning and cultural transmissions, are pivotal for co-directing the evolution of life. Trent?
Yes, just to underscore one thing I think is really important, what you brought up, is the difference between this model and Lamarck. Because this one, I think the Odling Smith model is like affirming the centrality of natural selection in the evolution of life. It's just that if we're only looking at the genes, that we would not really understand how certain individual organisms or group of organisms that are dealing with their selective pressure. It's not something that selective pressure is not like a monolithic at a whole set apart from individual activities or group behaviors. Instead, it's like shaped together between that the group behavior and the environment, hence the name niche construction. Therefore, it differs radically from Lamarck in the sense that the whole accumulation or like development, or in retrospect a certain steady and enhancement, certain capacity was not just naively based on individual or group will, so to speak. Instead, it was a very complicated negotiating process through like all kinds of different media of genetically based or non-genetically based information transmission mechanisms. Yes.
Yes. And I think the arc of the argument is now, hopefully, is clear. The basic idea of the book was to show us why the standard evolutionary theory is incomplete in so far as making sense of evolution of life is concerned. And it's incomplete, not wrong, because population genetics is a pivotal point in evolution of life. What is missing in the story of standard evolutionary theory is going back and understanding what really it takes to be an organism, or what are the prerequisites of life. Bioinformatics, bioenergetics, the balance between the two, and how this gets transmitted to the next generation. And if we are concerned about that, if we understand that the bioinformatics and its relationship with bioenergetics is what is making life going, we need to recognize all the ways that information passes through generations, not just genetics, but not because we are returning to a Lamarckian viewpoint, thinking that like change in this kind of like, I go to the gym, my kid has more muscles, giraffes stretch their necks, their children will have more muscles, but in more subtle, indirect ways, by changing the selective pressures and creating new patterns for life. These parallel information systems manipulate the energy information ratio and change the direction of life. I think that's it for me. This is going to be our last episode on talking about the book in the form of describing it. And the next episode is going to be our critical remarks. Any final thoughts, Trent?
No, I'm just looking forward to that moment to share our critical remarks, both appreciation as well as questions kind of inspired during the process of reading this book with our dear listeners. So, dear listeners, please stay attuned. Our critical remarks to the author Odling Smee's niche construction is coming up.